Box joints, or this interlocking pattern of pins and slots, is a classic way to dress up the corners of box projects like this tool chest. They form an interesting geometric pattern, but more than that, they make incredibly strong joints because of all of the surface area for glue between these pins and slots. If you've never made box joints before, they're pretty easy with a shop-made jig and either a spiral or straight bit at your router table. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make box joints using Triton's TWX7 Workcentre and its router table module. Now let's make a sample joint on some scrap material. Now my box joint jig is just a plywood base with a vertical fence and some bracing attached. And it slides back and forth on the two miter slots of this router table using two aluminum rails. Now I made the fence for my jig 6 inches tall so that I could support the long panels of this tool chest when routing them on end. That gave me enough bearing support so I could clamp them securely. As you can see here, there's a front layer of plywood that's bolted to my jig, and there's a 1/2 inch wide wooden pin installed in that. That 1/2 inch pin is set exactly 1/2 inch away from the router bit. And the space in between the pin and the router bit is what creates another pin in the joint each time the router bit cuts another slot. That spacing automatically indexes all these pins and slot cuts for the joints. I've got a 1/2 inch diameter spiral router bit installed, and it's raised 3/4 of an inch, but you could also use a 1/2 inch straight bit. And my router is set to full speed. I'm going to start the corner joint by clamping one of the sample panels on end against the fence. I position the edge of the panel flush against the jig's pin. That's very important to getting the pattern started correctly. Now because my tool chest panels are so tall when routing them on end, I didn't stand behind the box joint jig and push it through the cuts because it was just too hard to see down over the panels to what was going on. Instead, I came around to the front and pulled the jig through. It gave me great visibility of the bit and control for every cut. Start the router and slide the jig and panel through the bit to cut the first pin and slot. Make sure you cut all the way through the panel, but not all the way through your jig. Marking a stopping point on your router table surface with colored tape can prevent this from happening. Now we've got our first pin and slot. If we place that slot over the jig pin, we're all set to cut the second slot and the second pin. Cutting box joints is just repeating this process over and over again until you reach the other edge of the panel. Notice on our first panel that we've got a pin along the edge, and that came about when we cut that first slot. Well, now it's time to cut the mating half of the joint, but we can't cut it exactly the same way with a pin along the edge, or the parts won't go together so their edges are aligned. Instead, what it needs is a slot along the edge to mesh with that first pin. And in order to do that, we'll have to make a simple change to the setup process for routing the second half of the joint. In order to set up the alternate pattern for routing the second panel, here's what you do. Fit the first slot on the edge of the first panel over the jig's pin. That way, the first pin on the edge of this first panel fills the gap between the bit and the jig pin. Then, we can set our second panel against the first, and that way, the first cut that gets made on this second panel will be a slot cut rather than a pin cut. That sets up the correct pattern for routing the second panel. Clamp both panels to the jig fence, then make the first slot cut on the edge of the second panel. Now I've removed the first panel, and I can slide the second panel over so its slot along the edge fits over the jig pin. That sets it up for the second slot cut and this first inset pin. Make the slot cut to form the first pin, then go ahead and cut the rest of the pins and slots across the mating panel. And once you've got the mating piece cut, try to fit your joint together to see how you did. It should go together with an easy friction fit that doesn't take a lot of pounding. But if it clearly doesn't go together because the fit of the joint is too tight, or if you can see noticeable gaps in the pattern because the fit is too loose, you can improve the joint one way or the other by adjusting your jig. If the joint is too tight, it means the pins are too wide, so you need to move the pin on the jig closer to the bit to cut narrower pins. And if the joint is too loose, it means the pins are too narrow, so you need to move the jig's pin further away from the bit to cut wider pins to account for that. If you're using your jig for the first time, you should expect to have to do some tuning because it only takes the smallest amount of change to influence how these joints go together. Now my jig is pretty easy to adjust because when I cut the bolt holes in the fence for this front facing, I made them slotted. So I can shift this facing one way or the other a little bit as I need to and then tighten it down right where I want it when I get a good fit. Triton's accessory router table module with its extruded aluminum fence, micro adjusters, and a complement of feather boards can turn the TWX7 Workcentre into a hard-working routing system, whether you're routing box joints and other joints, or dados, grooves, and decorative profiles. Learn more about the system by visiting TritonTools.com.